don't think it was her field placement, but Kim Geyser was the pastor then and kind of took Barbara under his wing. And so it was a Christmas Eve service that Barbara um, assisted
Oh, wow.
when I was there. Yeah. Hmm. Lovely. Lovely how these things come around for
Indeed.
us. Mhm.
Welcome to everyone who is slowly joining us. We will start in about 1 minute. All right. Well, my clock has shifted to 2 p.m. I'm going to ask, hey kids, will you, thanks. There we go. That's the first step of logistics, Lego playing children. I'm going to begin with some logistics for those who are joining us in the Zoom webinar, a little bit of information about how it works. We are in the webinar format, which means that you will not have access to video or camera at this time. There will be a chat format below where you can share all of the goodness of your wisdom, and a Q&A section where you can put in any questions that you'd like to have the panelists talk about. And if you are watching us on the Facebook Live or on another social media platform, you can use the hashtag LutheransListen, or just put your comment right in the Facebook Live. If you put it in the wrong spot, it's fine. I will dig through them and try to bring them back into the conversation. The reminder that we do before all of our town halls is to remember that we are beautiful human beings, but we are human beings nonetheless. At some point in our town hall, there might be a technology glitch. We might remember what the exact year of something was. We're just going to embrace the spirit of community that we have here and rejoice in the ways that God comes to us through storytelling. And I have a very wonderful assembled group of folk who are here with us on this Friday of Pride Week. And I'm very delighted to share them with you all. We're going to begin. If you haven't seen the video that I posted this week about Daniel Harms telling his story, to just name that as the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, began a 3-year process of trying to merge 3 separate Lutheran bodies into one. That process was very committed to several types of justice and very nervous about things that could lead to the merger not happening. One of the things that began to happen is that for the first time in the Lutheran Church, there was created this rule that said that LGB, and I'm intentionally stopping at LGB because we've never had a policy about trans people, but there was a rule that said that people who were diverse in their sexual orientation maybe should be celibate, maybe shouldn't be pastors at all, and different parts of the Lutheran Church named this in different ways. But it was something that started to bubble up. The first bubbling of it that I have found is when a gay man was elected as a bishop in the state of Texas. His name was Daniel Harms, and I'll put a link to the video below if you'd like to learn more of that story. Instead of celebrating the gifts of this one pastor, they created a policy to try to prevent all gay pastors in the future from serving in the church. And this process continues into the very forming of what happens in the ELCA. And that story sort of begins with one of our panelists today. So Jeff, would you be willing to introduce yourself and tell folk a little bit about what was going on in the church around this time?
Thanks, Megan. My name's Jeff Johnson. I'm the pastor currently at University Lutheran Chapel of Berkeley. And I've been the pastor there for 20 years. It's the Lutheran campus ministry at the University of California. Prior to that, I was the pastor at First United Lutheran Church in San Francisco, one of 2 congregations that was expelled from the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in 1995 for having called an openly gay man and two lesbian women, Ruth Frost and Phyllis Zilhart. I went to seminary around the same time that the Commission for a New Lutheran Church was forming, prior to the creation of the ELCA way back in the mid-1980s. And at that time, Pastor Dan Harms's story was unknown to us, as was the story of so many other lesbian and gay pastors in the predecessor Lutheran churches who were invisible, who were hidden, who were secret. There was a secret listserv, a mailing list that circulated among all the pastors, but because of policies that were mostly implicit, policies that had not yet been written down formally, people feared for their lives, for their relationships, for their careers. I was in seminary with a group of 4 or 5 other gay and lesbian seminarians. There were eventually 4 of us who decided by the end of our seminary career to publicly announce, right as the ELCA was in formation, that we were gay and that we were unwilling to subscribe to any kind of vow of celibacy, which wasn't at that point being required. It was just assumed. It was assumed that the church had no place in its theology or practice for any kind of relationship among people of the same sex. At the time we came out, there was a large controversy, and there was a document made. This implicit bias became explicit in the form of Vision and Expectations, which is a document that the church has lived with now for 30 years. It was finally abolished this year, but only in name. The intent of the document continues to be embedded in the constitutions of our church in the form of definitions and guidelines, which has taken the place of this explicit bias that was created at the time of our coming out in the late 80s. So it's important to know that ELCA congregations have been ordaining and calling openly queer people for 30 years, since the formation of the church. For 20 of those years, it was illegal. And all of the calls and ordinations that happened were what Dr. Krister Stendahl, the former dean at Harvard Divinity School, called extra ordinem, or extraordinary, outside of the order. Valid, but illegal. And it was this movement, which was really predicated on the whole notion of resistance to implicit and explicit bias against same-sex people and same-sex humanness and same-sex relationships. This movement of resistance that found its deepest expression in a common commitment to principled non-compliance with these policies of discrimination and oppression, resistance, and also anticipation, living now in anticipation of the day when we knew these policies would be lifted, would be abolished, which happened then a long time later, 20 years later. So part of this movement is testimony to the difficulty our church has in standing with people in their full humanity and engaging in the struggle for justice. And I hope that one of the things that we are learning in this moment is that we need to be more nimble, we need to be more responsive, and we need to be more proactive in accompanying people who are navigating into a more liberated future. Because for 20 years, the church didn't do that with us. We did it ourselves, and we did it with allies in the church, but the church was hugely resistant to taking the steps that it needed to take. Megan, is that a helpful way of introducing things?
Yes, that was wonderful.
Okay. All right.
Craig, you sort of pop into the timeline next. Would you be willing to introduce yourself and tell folk a little bit about how you became extraordinary? I think you're on mute. There we go.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, I'm happy to take part in this. It's good to see all of my colleagues here. So my name's Craig, and I grew up in Tampa, Florida. I started seminary in 1994. So if you remember, President Clinton was in office. It was a very interesting time in the mid 90s. I was ordained in 2001, and that was after a roller coaster ride of a candidacy process. I had been told by many of my seminary faculty, friends, staff that you can, pursue an MDiv, but you're never going to get a call if you're out. I came out in seminary in my second year and was pretty clear that I couldn't do public ministry without being publicly honest about who I was. It seemed like death to try to be in the closet. And I know that sounds hyperbolic, but it wasn't hyperbolic for me. I serve congregations in Oakland, California, in the East Bay, in Alameda as well, in Castro Valley. I serve kids in a wide range, as well as working with our Synod Youth Committee. One of the things that I am moved by is that even though I was told that ministry was not possible for me, ironically enough, I have been in the longest call of anyone in my seminary class. I've been serving my call for 20 years. And so while what was told to me was that it wasn't possible, God made things possible. Now I say that with fear and trembling because I stand on the shoulders of the giants of many of the people who've gone before us, who were voiceless, who were ground in the mechanisms of the system. When I started seminary, there were 3 or 4 openly gay candidates, and none of them are serving in ministry. My second year when I came out, there were 12 of us out of a 22-person dorm who were G, L, B, or T, or other. And so there was an amazing shift in that time. I saw the folks who had so much turmoil, pain, and hurt in their process, and I got to carry some of that with me. But then I did get to the day of ordination. It's not that it was a prize or something that I was trying to win, but God's call was so strong in my life to have that realized is something that I still don't understand fully, and I'm trying to make sense of. And I still pay homage to all of those heroes and sheroes who've gone before me, all along the gender spectrum. So heroes, sheroes, regardless. Who went before me, who didn't have that call honored, and they had it silenced, and in many ways there was spiritual violence done against them. One of the things that I want to raise up is that in Oakland, we were very much aware of the congregations that had been expelled at the end of the 90s. I believe it was end of the 90s. First United and St. Francis by the ELCA. In Oakland, I was working with Pastor Ross Merkel, who had also been going through his ecclesiastical trial. I didn't know him during that time, but shortly after, so a few years later, I began working at St. Paul Lutheran Church. And one of the things the clergy that got together discussed was we can make stances where we are picked off as churches one by one, but if we stand together, and many churches make a stand together, it's harder for a national denomination, even as closed-minded as they were at the time, to kick out a whole city of congregations. And so that strategy was something that I found to be not only moving, but also theologically grounded in a faith tradition that claims to be reformed and reforming. And I believe that we aspire to that, but we still have a lot of work to do. And so I was moved and challenged to step into that public witness, to be out there and put myself at risk, and my family at risk. in regard to what happens when you take that public stand. And I can say that there were many small experiences of homophobia and outright aggression. But by and large, the people who stood up and stood with me have stayed with me almost my whole ministry. Standing up together in that collective voice has been an amazing gift, and it's something that I am thankful for to this day. So I was ordained in 2001, and I served 6 congregations. So I think it's important to raise up that that model, and that has been crazy making and both life-giving at the same time. I'm always putting out a fire, but there's never a quiet time where I'm wondering what it is I'm called to or what I'm to do in this world. A lot of times it's pruning and trying to figure out where I share my time. So I'll stop there. My challenge is not to tell the whole story, but to be succinct, and hopefully I've been able to achieve some of that.
You're getting some high praise from folk in Canada, especially Lionel's family. So,
hey, Lionel.
So I'm Pastor Megan Rohrer, and I am currently the pastor at Grace Lutheran in the Sunset in San Francisco, and I entered this extraordinary ordination story in 2016. I was called by her church. We'll talk more about that. Saints Mary and Martha, Santa Maria y Martha Lutheran Church in San Francisco, St. Francis, and Christ Church Lutheran. The thing that I like to point out about that call to serve the homeless is that the diversity of those congregations in how they see God, how they name God, right? Christ Church only uses Lord language, and they're very high church. St. Francis uses gender neutral language, still a little bit high church, right? Santa Maria y Martha uses Señor for God. So if you think, as some people have hypothesized, that diversity is one of the reasons LGBTQ people cannot be welcomed. Santa Maria y Martha was one of the first to sign on to wanting to call me because they just thought it was just. And they wanted to take a stance to say that God doesn't love LGBT people less. And my calling to her church was very formative because when there were times that I received hate mail or got on the list of like bad clergy outfits or whatever the way was that people had smart in different time periods, people would say, Pastor Megan, we can't do it. But then they would go on this really long rant about her church and about how you can't use any divine language that is feminine. And I was really grateful for that because it reminded me that at the heart of people's fear of my being called to serve God was a lot of misogyny. Was this fear that if the pastors could be diverse, maybe God could be diverse, and fear about what it would mean if God was diverse. And we haven't got to what happens, the 10-year anniversary that we're celebrating yet, but there was a moment when we were having this worship service and it came a time to become ordinary. I don't think it took for any of us, but we're working on it. And the powers that be were trying to make all these decisions about what the language of that worship service should be. And they really wanted the language to just be kind of like, Lord, like the language that the synod uses at most services. And to kind of quiet us down, at one point the bishop says, well, you have to use the language of your congregations. You can't be so radical. Like we wanted to include Swahili, which was our sister synod. Like we wanted to have a very diverse worship service. And they said, no, just of your congregations, because there was this assumption that our congregations would be not as diverse as the service we were calling for. But because I was called by a Spanish-speaking congregation, a church that uses goddess language, and churches that are kind of at the forefront of trying to figure out how to do high church with a diverse kind of love, it made more room for the language of the future. And it's really shaped the way I see being a pastor, because I always think about translating the Bible and speaking to people and doing outreach in a way that is really speaking to the languages of those who have called me. And to have that many diverse ways to describe God be the language of the community that called me, it freed me and gave me a permission to care for whomever I encountered in the world and whatever language they needed to encounter God in a way that made them feel loved. And I think without that diverse group of calling congregations, I think I might have maybe gone a more traditional route. And so we've done everything from Lady Gaga mass to I don't know, we made a 12-foot tall Black Jesus statue that marched in the Pride Parade last year, right? And so I like to think that some of that freedom that I've had in my ministry came from the fact that such an eclectic group decided to call me. And then a whole month later, something else happened. Dawn, will you introduce yourself and talk about your ordination?
Sure. I'm Dawn Roginski, and I'm currently serving a congregation in Vallejo, California, United in Grace Lutheran. And I wanted to lift up something that people haven't lifted up yet, and that is the people of the Extraordinary Candidacy Project. And so I went to seminary at Luther Seminary in Minnesota. And at the time I came out, I was not aware of any other MDiv students who were out. Excuse me. So it was a very lonely experience. And when the seminary faculty denied my approval based on vision and expectations, the Extraordinary Candidacy Project was there to pick up my candidacy. Now, this is a group of people who were mostly lay people, and they did a heck of a lot of work. And they became our candidacy committee. And they had the same rules as the ELCA did, except for that they didn't require celibacy from people who identified as queer. And they really walked with us, and they provided a community for us so that we didn't have to feel so alone and isolated. Because even though there's a heck of a lot of Lutherans in Minnesota, being at a seminary where there isn't any was hard. And so I'm very grateful to them and want to lift them up. I graduated seminary in 2002, and then I waited 5 years for a first call. And I was called to St. Francis Lutheran in San Francisco. And I think, the reason it took such a long time for people to get a call was that churches who called one of us actually faced the possibility of discipline. Now, St. Francis and First United had been put on trial and kicked out. And so there was a whole level of fear. And I think there were a lot of congregations who may wanted to call one of us as their pastor, but were afraid. And, didn't want to get in trouble with the ELCA. And so they didn't do it. But, when the call became available at St. Francis, they're like, well, we're already kicked out, so what does it matter? And, it was a term call, so I was there for 3 years, and it was a wonderful place to be. And they have since returned to the ELCA. They were invited back along with First United. So that's kind of my story.
Thank you. Susan, will you tell the story of the unusual way you became a part of the roster?
Sure. It's a little bit different perspective, but I came out to, not came out, I came
Don't
to,
forget to introduce yourself. Sorry.
I'm okay.
Yeah, introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Pastor Susan Strauss. I'm the pastor at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Burlingame, California, which is just south of San Francisco. I was the pastor at First United Lutheran Church for 13 years, following Jeff, and then following Pastor Lyle Beckman, also an out gay man at First United. And I had come to Berkeley to do my DMin in interfaith theology, and was not really looking to be in a parish setting again, but was approached by a member of First United who was on an interfaith committee along with me and said, "You should interview at First United. We're looking for a pastor." And I said, "I can't do that. You're not in the ELCA. What would happen to my pension? I can't do that." But then I started thinking, I've always believed that you can't just turn down a call because it might be a call. And so I said, okay, I will pursue this. Went through the interview process and ended up being called. And in the process, talking with the bishop at the time, was informed that if I did this, I would be put on leave from call. Even though Lyle, this is crazy. This is the crazy part, is that Jeff, of course, was not recognized on the ELCA roster, but Lyle was given a call through the Synod Council to First United. But the bishop said, "No, we won't do that for you. You'll be put on leave from call." So I get, it's, for me, doing something like that is putting up a red flag to a bull. It's like, go ahead. And so I went ahead and went to First United thinking, well, big deal, put me on leave from call. I'm getting older. I can get it. And First United, got enrolled in another pension plan and everything. The difficulty that I didn't understand was that I wouldn't be able to get disability insurance. That was kind of the scary part of it, but okay, there we are. And at that time, the merger that would become ELM, Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, was beginning. And in conversation with Jeff, wanted to include congregations in this new organization, have a congregational roster that would be representative of congregations that had taken the stand of calling somebody from the ELM. Well, it wasn't ELM yet, but the Extraordinary Candidacy Project. So I actually became part of the formation team of ELM, and then became part of the first board representing the congregational group. So that's how I came into being the only straight person in ELM. And then because being put on leave from call in the ELCA, which endangered my roster status, the ELM Candidacy Committee interviewed me. I was just as nervous for that as I was for my original candidacy committee, but they were delightful. And so I became part of the ELM roster, which was awesome. And I felt so welcomed and so grateful and willing that they were willing to accept me into their group. So then the policy changed, of course, and the congregational group was not as necessary, and I turned off of the board, and ELM went on to become what it is today. So I'm not as involved. Well, I guess I'm going to be involved again, because now my partner is a trans woman, and so I guess I get to come back in as a spouse. But somehow, whatever, I'm happy. So I think, does that kind of give you the story?
Yes, it's always a good story to figure out how there was a roster of LGBTQ pastors and Susan.
Yeah.
And to have you describe that kind of in your own language. So for those who are listening, the policy that was about trying to exclude LGBTQ pastors was not used on Susan's gay out predecessor at her congregation, but was used on her. ponder what that means. So as we move through this timeline, you might notice that there's another person that we have included on this panel. We have Pastor Noah with us. You might know why we included Noah already if you've seen the newest season of Queer Eye. But Noah, would you be willing to introduce yourself and then share if you were even aware of any of this as you were coming up in your story?
Sure, would be happy to. So I'm Noah Hepler. I'm the pastor at Atonement Lutheran in the fabulous Fishtown neighborhood of Philadelphia, and a community itself that is going through tremendous changes, it seems almost daily. And to be 26 now year old congregation in the midst of that is both challenging and life-giving in a way you can't stop. Was I aware? Barely. So I started seminary, maybe I should go back. I became Lutheran in 92, leaving fundamentalism. And just to give you the context for that, I went to a fundamentalist school from kindergarten, 4-year-old kindergarten, all the way to 12th grade. And then I went to a Southern Baptist University and became Lutheran in the middle of that because my rebellion was playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I met Catholics and I fell in love with the liturgy. And I said, there must be other Protestants that do liturgy that aren't Catholics, because we had been told that Catholics were closet Satanists. So, you know, that seemed dangerous to me to get mixed up with them. I've come a long way. So so became Lutheran in 92 and then entered into seminary in 96. And when I got to seminary, which was Southern Lutheran Southern in Columbia, South Carolina, and I entered into Southern pretty much still towing the fundamentalist line on sexuality and gender. And that began to change for me. I'm trying to remember exactly when, but it was near the end of my first year at seminary. I was already having to begin to rethink things. And I know at times Southern has not had the reputation where you think somebody would have that experience. But when I got there, I'm pretty sure straight people were the minority at Southern's campus. And that was one of the things that I had to deal with as not even knowing that I was closeted, but also being a recovering fundamentalist. I was having to deal with, you know, some pretty orthodox Lutherans who also were gay. Or the language at the time in the church with gay and lesbian, mostly just gay, but the whole LGBTQ plus community was there at Southern. And in fact, my first year there, the student body was voting to become RIC, which is how I learned about reconciling in Christ. That and a quirky little magazine that was in the library called Bride of Christ. And one of my friends who was a lesbian would read that a lot, and she kept pointing out, she said, look at all these churches in the back advertising and this Bride of Christ, and they're all RIC. And I'm like, what is that? And so I learned what that was. And that began the process for me of wrestling with the church's acceptance, what I had been taught, especially by my church, growing up, versus a more nuanced approach, especially to scripture, that I was completely unaware of. And then there was something called IRC, Internet Relay Chat on the internet. What that was, the predecessor to social media, was these chat rooms. It's still around, but it's still as creepy as it's ever been. And but it was there was a Lutheran channel that I would get on quite a bit and kind of process some of the stuff that I was struggling with. And there was actually where I first heard about specifically St. Francis, and that they had been that they had been removed from the ELCA. It was a very nuanced discussion, actually, because the people who were talking about it were very careful to move it out of the sexuality question. It was merely about roster. And I don't know where that was in the stratagem of things, but it was like, no, they were removed because they called somebody who wasn't on the roster, and tried to keep it away from sexuality. Meanwhile, the discussion was continuing within the larger church, and the larger church had asked the seminaries to hold these gatherings and to discuss the sexuality issue. And what I remember, there were a couple of things for me that were beginning to kind of break my shell, which was also leading me eventually to come out. But somebody during the ethics professor's presentation said, basically, they said, what about the parts don't fit argument? And he responded by saying, we're Christians, and we believe that the Bible teaches us that one day lions will lie down with lambs. Why do we care whether or not parts fit? And that's the kind of thing that began to stick with me. I encountered other things that broke open that shell for me. So was I aware? Barely. I think when I became more aware was when I went back into seminary to do an STM and then start my PhD work. Was at the beginning of '09. So of course, by the end of that year, a great shift had occurred, and I learned more at that point about ELM and everything. And then I had begun.
I think we had a bit of a pause from Noah there.
Implementation of change. So the big thing that I did was, behind the scenes, I wrote a little piece to be distributed strategically to certain bishops who were concerned that there was not a historic precedent in receiving people back, that language. And I said there was. I studied St. Augustine of Hippo for my PhD. And of course, Augustine had a long ongoing battle with the Donatists. So I very carefully wrote about a 2-page paper that said the LGBTQ plus Q plus community, they're not Donatists, but there is something that happened with the church and its discussion around Donatism that applies here. And Augustine said, we shouldn't reordain them. And if Augustine could welcome Donatists back, who were, they tried to kill him. If Augustine could do that, then certainly on more friendly terms, the church ought not to impose reordination on people who have been faithful. And apparently that worked for a couple of bishops, and so that's my claim to fame with that. And so obviously, then with Queer Eye, I have been much more interested. I think Craig, you would use the term standing on the shoulders of giants. And as I had come out, really felt like I had done the same, because then I began to hear the stories of all those who had gone before me and said, wow, my experience right now is directly tied to the struggle that those people had gone through, that I am now graced and gifted by to be myself. And so it's time, as you hear in the show, I say I don't feel like I can be that kind of leader. Well, I got a big, gracious, merciful, and loving push into it, and I remain ever thankful for that.
Thank you, Noah. It's such a beautiful way to illustrate that it doesn't matter when you appeared in the timeline. What matters is that God loves you and names you and claims you, and that you're kind of being a pastor the best way that you can. And I think that's been one of the difficulties of trying to tell these stories, is that sometimes it does leave people feeling like whoever's been around in the timeline the longest is the most important. And so trying to tell these stories in ways that honor all the places people have entered in and stepped out and showed up for each other is really, really important. Towards the end of your time chatting, you mentioned that there was this great debate in the Lutheran Church about whether or not those of us who had been extraordinarily ordained needed to be reordained. There's a number of microaggressions that happened before that. Like at synod assemblies, we weren't allowed to have votes. So we couldn't vote, even though we were members of the Lutheran Church. Our name tags didn't have the word reverend on them, but every other pastor who attended did. I donated mine to an archive where I had written in every single year the word reverend on my name tag. And my favorite was the year we got scarlet red name tags, because they wanted to not make us look like visitors, but scarlet red was so much more poetic. Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, and we were declared vacant, right? All the churches that we served were listed as vacant. And my favorite example was we had a regional meeting where there was a regional leader who was going around the room introducing all of the pastors in the room. And when she got to, I was sitting in the corner with my council president, and when she got to us, she skipped over us and continued. So we were invisible for so long, and the system kind of reinforced that invisibility. So being in ELCA circles was really painful, was kind of excruciating.
We actually have a question in the Q&A that I will take now instead of later, because I think it fits with what we're talking about. The question was, what was the consequence of being removed from the ELCA? But I'll just offer it up to all of us. What was the consequence? What was one of the consequences you feel comfortable sharing and talking about publicly of this policy that existed? For me, I'll share a consequence most people don't think about, and that's that my seminary cost more than straight people's seminary, because seminaries have a rate for people who are part of the Lutheran ordination process, and then a rate for people who are not in the Lutheran ordination process. It wasn't my, right? Here I am, I can do no other. And so what it meant was I paid about, I think it was $3,000 more a semester. So there was a literal, I still have a literal student loan cost that comes along with this policy. I also have, anytime I get an email from the synod or the bishop's office, I wonder if I'm in trouble. And that's, I think, PTSD.
And along with that, we did not have access to scholarship money either, that a lot of people depended on.
In addition to that, the first 5 or 6 years of my ministry, the ELCA only sent me letters addressed to Mr. And while it's one letter difference, Mr. and Pastor, it sure hurt every time I opened up those letters. Not just microaggression, it was just aggressive. Yeah.
You know, I think there was a huge consequence to the church, right? I think the church compromised its ability to be trustworthy with LGBTQIA+ people, and really sacrificed for decades its witness. So, you know, people wonder why progressives stay away from the Lutheran Church or Lutheran Church communities. For decades, they've heard that this is not a welcoming space, it's not a safe space, it's not an affirming space. And so I think that, you know, part of the expulsions that happened, or the trials, really compromised the witness of the Lutheran Church.
And one of the things I forgot to name in the timeline is that these policies that started to say that LGBTQ people can't be on whichever side of the communion rail was being debated were created in the middle of an epidemic, in the middle of the AIDS crisis. People were literally dying and didn't know why. They were being abandoned by their government, and they were being abandoned by some healthcare systems. People, some places weren't even able to use funeral care services. And to have a church be debating you and creating a policy that a pastor can't be like you, it's beyond something you just need confession and forgiveness for, and it goes to something you need to ask atonement for, because that timeline of being paired with the AIDS crisis We might get it now. Has anyone had an experience where during the middle of the pandemic, you've thought, how dare you do that to me? And in the middle of a pandemic, right? That's a small portion of what that timeline has meant to people and why it's lasted a lot longer, I think. Noah, what was the consequence of this policy in your life?
For me, first of all, was seeing the friends that I made getting to Southern, how it was affecting them, and not yet knowing how it would affect me, but how it affected them. Then it was, I came out actually in '06. So it was a double crisis of coming to terms with who I was and then realizing the church was not welcoming me. So it was a much smaller window for me, but it was beginning to see that. I think for me now, it's exactly what you mentioned about the simple kind of I call it an American brand of forgive and forget, confession and forgiveness style without wrestling with and making metanoia, making change and how we do things, or owning up to the damage that was done, and then expecting everybody to suddenly be okay with the church because, well, now we welcome. And for me, that's the big thing with whatever definitions and guidelines or discipline and guidelines, whatever it's called, D&G, that it doesn't own the fact that the church helped create an atmosphere where people had to be in the closet, where that's a soapbox. I'm gonna step away from that, but there's that's how for me it affects in those different stages of seeing the harm done to my friends, and then realizing it also applied to me, and then now the way that we just it's attempted to be dismissed.
Susan, do you want to add any consequences?
Well, certainly not to the extent that others had, but I think more from the maybe congregation's standpoint of the difficulty that it was to not be part of the ELCA, as Jeff was talking about, to be, and from my understanding, when they were expelled, the understanding or the statement had been that the synod would always be in relationship. Is that correct? Maybe I heard that wrong, but that was what I heard, that they would be in relationship with these two congregations, which was not true at all. And there was even one synod assembly in which I guess the bishop really was pressured into agreeing to write a letter of invitation to the two congregations to come back, to apply to come back into the ELCA. But it was very clear that if we did apply, we'd be rejected. And so when the letter came, it was a no-brainer to say, no, thank you. And then at the next Synod Assembly, when the report came out of the Secretary's report, it was reported that letters of gracious invitation were sent by the bishop to First United and St. Francis, but we have heard no response. And so the damage done to a congregation lasts. The PTSD or the implications last a long time. And so even when the policy changed, the decision to go back into the ELCA was a very difficult one for First United. It took several years of wrestling with why would we? Because the hurt was so deep there. And even when they did, it was more of a sense of we can do more to keep changing things from within than without. So we're going back, but it was in no way kind of a celebration of, oh yeah, the ELCA now has everything right. So that's sort of the...
Well, and we just got a very interesting question from Facebook that has been seconded. Has there been any offers of reparations to any of us, or efforts towards reparations? I'm gonna just say it. I'll just say it. I'll try to say it nice because there's a lot of people on mute right now, so I'm gonna do my best. Jeff is laughing because the the service that we had. So in 2009, the policy changed. Stop it, Jeff. The ELCA, the ELCA changed their policy, and they decided that they were going to no longer have these list of rules or celibacy tests for pastoral candidates. Then they went through a process in the Council of Bishops with several drafts of whether or not we should have to be reordained, those of us who are extraordinarily ordained, or what that process should look like. The process was guided a lot by the secretary of the ELCA, and there was a lot of very strict rules about what every single word of our worship service had to be scripted. And many of the scripted languages were to not acknowledge that prior to that moment of that service, we had been pastors before. And I'll put a link to the service, the video and the scripts. If you're interested in reading them, you can look at the places where Bishop Holmrud said the word continue to be pastors 3 times and decide if you think that is reparations. I've had a personal apology from a person who works in connection with the seminary about the fact that I paid more. I requested on the 30-year anniversary of the AIDS crisis, which also was the 30-year anniversary of the creation of Vision and Expectations. I did request a formal act of repentance from the ELCA, since that has been a thing they are doing recently. It made it very high up the ladder. I hope it happens someday, that service. Anyone else get an offer of reparations? Jeff? Craig? You're unmuted.
Okay, so not reparations, but another cost that would be connected to this is that for the first 7 years of my ministry, I was not able to get on a rostered pension level. And so I lost a lot of money in my pension. And finally, toward the rite of reception or just a few years before, was able to be, was placed in that category of being a pastor, but I had already been a pastor. And in fact, I find it really ironic that I'm almost, I'm 20 years in, so I was 10 years as a extraordinary pastor, as we have mentioned earlier in the conversation, and I've been 10 years an ordinary pastor, to use that language. And what night and day experiences those have been. So yeah, reparations, not so much. I'll also say that one of the costs of the policy was experienced by me in my very brutal candidacy process, where some very nice, well-intentioned people who were avoiding conflict or avoiding taking a stand foisted all of those decisions of the policy or those ramifications of the policy on me. I was making the decision. It was my decision to not be celibate. And I called them out and said, that's BS, and referred to Martin Luther as our, if we're really going to hold up Martin Luther and the reformed and reforming person that he was, maybe we should look there as well. And the many people along the way who said, oh, I'm so sorry to hear this very hard story you've been going through. And they would listen for 30 minutes and make it seem like they were allies. And then at the end of that say, oh, but there's nothing I can do. Oh, I just can't, we just can't say anything. So one of the things that I challenged them with was to say, I am here, I'm publicly making the stand. You can choose to say no, or you can choose to say yes. If you say yes, that means it's going to go to the next level. Fine, kick it up to the next level. Let the next higher ups have to deal with it. But if you're saying no, say no because you really believe that I shouldn't be a pastor, and say yes if you do. I was denied at that point, but at least I could challenge the system and say, this is unjust, and that level of inequality was just terrible. So yeah.
I think the question around reparations is hilarious. It's a hilarious question, because I think even at this point, the church is so proud of its decision in 2009 that it won't recognize the harm that it has done in the past and that it continues to do. LGBTQIA plus candidates are put through hoops that straight candidates never face in the candidacy process. In mobility processes, candidates in mobility are subjected to a different regime when their names go before churches. Congregations are permitted to discriminate in ways against queer candidates that they're not permitted against any other candidates in our church. So there are still forms of explicit bias that are allowed under the invention of something called bound conscience, right? Bound conscience gives permission, even a decade after its articulation, permission for awful things to continue to happen. And the bureaucracy of the church is reluctant to celebrate too openly, right? And to criticize those whose conscience is bound to discriminate. So that prevents acknowledging harm, and it prevents any discussion about reparations. There have been many words of repentance, but the next step of actually listening deeply to queer people in our communities and to queer leaders, listening deeply and repairing broken relationships, not as frequently done.
Let's chat a little bit more about that service. Oh, before I move on, I wanted to name, so this policy changed in 2009. This service happened in 2010, which wasn't supposed to acknowledge we had been pastors before. If you don't know how pastors are paid, there's this formula that takes the number of years of experience you have since your ordination, and it adds it to like the housing costs in your zip code, and then adds a bunch of other things. It's called clergy compensation. So when I got my call here at Grace Lutheran in 2014, 5 years after the policy changed, they called the bishop's office and they said, how should we fill out this form, right? Megan was extraordinarily ordained. How should we do it? And they said, for the number of years of worship experience, like each year is $1,000 on your salary, right? You should use 2010, which is $6,000 a year off of a salary. Jeff, if your congregation would ever do that, that's 20 years, right? Off of a salary. And so there is kind of an ongoing numeric, I would have to be someone who agrees to that contract, but it puts it on me to figure that out when a bishop's office could have talked in a different way. So there are still continued like financial implications of answers that people get about when we were ordained. But let's talk a little bit about the service that happened in 2010, since we're at the 10-year anniversary of that. And I wondered if Dawn and Jeff and Craig and Susan, you were there. You just didn't have to have a bishop whisper in your ear, right? And so I wonder if folk can share a story from that service that you think times like these, it might be helpful to hear. Anybody want to go first? I'll go first then. The thing that I was struck by, number one, was the collegiality that we had around that service. We met every week for the months leading up to the service, not to necessarily plan the service, but to get our emotions in the right place, to make sure we weren't too wounded to be the people who participated in the service. And you can't ever fix all your wounds, but it was better. We also did some really creative liturgy, right? Remember I said every single word was scripted, but every single action was not. And so some of my favorite liturgy ever became a part of that service. For example, there were a couple of words that were required to be said that I'm not going to repeat because we didn't want them heard then, and so I'm not going to say them now. So we were the first who were doing this ritual, so we kind of made up what the actions were like that were going to be accompanied by these rituals. And so if you see bishops leaning in and whispering in pictures about the service, it's because we chose to have an opera singer sing as loud as possible, so no one other than the six of us would have to hear the words that weren't just yet. Right? We knew the ELCA was going to have better language about what was happening and about this story. And if people heard on a microphone those words, it broke my heart to have them whispered in my ear. We knew that if those words lived in the minds of people in history, it would not be the celebration that people thought the service was, right? This service of finally there is a denomination that's opening up to this. And so I think I wouldn't have gone that direction if there wasn't a bunch of colleagues that we were working through this with, if we hadn't have met that many times. But I also remember I strategically had planned a vacation in Hawaii right before this worship service. And I remember sitting and watching the sunset in Hawaii, drinking a pina colada, and Jeff being on the other line talking about very important liturgy decisions that needed to happen. And I think even up to 3 days before this service happening, I was unclear whether or not we were going to show up that day, because how it felt. It just felt like every decision about whether or not you could have the word "the" or say the Holy Spirit did this thing became more complicated than it needed to be. And I'm grateful that the story of the service is less harmful than it felt to participate in it, or that's my hope at least.
There were conversations that we were having, Megan, right, that you mentioned right up to the day about whether or not we were going to return to the roster, right? And I think there was a conviction among a majority of there were 46 or 48, 50 extraordinarily rostered clergy, that if there was any hint that this was a reordination, then we would have nothing to do with it, right? That and that was a deeply compelling conversation to be a part of. So we were hoping that the church wouldn't go down that route, but we were pretty convinced that if people started pretending that that's what this was, that we would run from this rite of reception, because we didn't want to send the wrong impression at all to anybody. I thought it was a really spectacular day in our synod. It was fun. The church at St. Mark Lutheran in San Francisco was filled, and there were a couple of California bishops. The Episcopal bishop was there. We had a great preacher. It was a fun event, and a really fitting way for people who for 20 years had been working so hard in our area to come together and really celebrate this milestone. It by no means is the last milestone, and it's but a stepping stone but it was worth coming together and celebrating it on our terms. It really felt like we were able to do it on our terms, which was important.
I wanted to ask, was that liturgy used across the ELCA, or because I feel like, and maybe I'm just remembering this more kindly than I ought to, but I feel like here in Philadelphia, it was an installation service with the language tweaked to not have it talk about the beginning of a ministry, but a continuing ministry. But it did follow more of installation rather than definitely, I think, further from ordination.
It became used differently regionally, and it depended on the bishop in each jurisdiction. We were not the first group that was ready to move forward with this rite, but we were located in the Bay Area, where it was believed that for all of the pastors who would go through this rite, we might have the best luck making the liturgy edible. And that means that we're the people who saw how the sausage was made. And so our relation to the liturgy is different than people who experience the different flavors of how it happened in spaces kind of all over the country after that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, I remember, you know, a couple of things stick in my mind, and one was kind of the absurdity of the media, right? So we were the first ones, and so tons of media everywhere, including a photographer from the New York Times who thought that he could go wherever he wanted to go because he was from the New York Times. And I remember one incident where Megan and I were in this hallway, and we started to walk down the hallway, and somebody's like, "No, back up and come back down." And I'm like, what? It was just, it felt a little bit absurd to me, but you know what, they wanted the photo, so we did that. But and the other thing I remember is there were some very poignant, beautiful parts to the service. We had Judith Lavender Dancer do a liturgical dance that brought me, and I think a whole lot of people, to tears. And it was really powerful. And for me personally, my parents were able to be there. And my dad is a man who's normally very stoic. You know, he doesn't show a whole lot of emotion. And during the piece, he had tears in his eyes because he's like, I get it. And I just started bawling, and I still feel emotional about it now. So there were some really beautiful things that happened that day. And that's what I hold on to.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'll add, as I said about my clinical pastoral education experience, my time working at a trauma hospital as a student pastor, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. It was so hard and devastating and challenging, and yet I learned so much, and there's so much I still reflect back on. That service is in a lot of ways very similar in that it's the culmination of such pain and hurt and rejection and the fear that so many people brought in not proclaiming the truth for so long. People who were, you know, judging on the outside, or people in the system who were giving into that fear. And yet it was amazing to look up in the balcony and see kids that I had worked with for the previous decade from all over the synod. I'm a youth pastor, and so that has its own challenges in being publicly, openly gay, and then working with youth. And so there have been a lot of challenges, but also to see that sea of witnesses, that's what buoys my spirit. And the preaching was amazing. Being with colleagues, I know I'm a crier. Megan knows this. And so she was holding my hand the whole way through and letting me cry, because it was both tears of joy, but also tears of grief.
Yeah, and after the service, I don't know if everyone experienced this, but the number of people who reached out for conversation because they were either from traditions who weren't there yet, or they were so celebratory of what was happening and wanted to know how they could reconnect with faith now that there was this new opportunity that it felt like had arisen. Very similar, it feels like, to my current situation after the Queer Eye episode has come out. Noah, I think for many people, even though most people didn't attend the 125th live, right? So many people have felt like they attended that service, and I wish that there was a video of your full sermon. It was really beautiful, and this process of you being publicly out on Netflix and online, I think has birthed a whole new group of people who are awakening now to become a part of this timeline and to see that there are churches who are loving and accepting. What has the process of the aftermath, all the people reaching out to you as a famously liberated LGBTQ Lutheran now?
Yeah. So far, I think the only negative mail that I've gotten was a voicemail from somebody who was not happy with my interpretation of the centurion's slave, and I couldn't help but listen to that and think, I read it actually. I read the Google transcript of it and think there are so many other points to nitpick on that one, like, you know, slavery, for one. Even though Roman slavery wasn't the same, it's still slavery. And there are all kinds of other things that we might want to dig around on that text in question. But, you know, the centurion called it gets translated as servant in one place. He called him boy, you know, and so that has implicated. But anyway, that's the only negative. The rest of it has been this outpouring of positive and astonishment, and I as I said in the interview with Living Lutheran, I really hope that the church sees in my experience what embodying the theology of the cross could look like for the church in general, if it would embody that on a multiplicity of intersecting topics around race, around gender, around sexuality, and say, you know, there are times we have not handled this well, and to own that and be vulnerable about it. And as Bobby said in one of those interviews, I am not the category of pastor who needs to be offering him, and nor was Bishop Guy with me, not the right person to be saying sorry. And I hope that the church sees that and picks up on that and begins to apply that as an institution.
Well, relating to what you just said, we have a question. We've actually had several questions along this same line, and that will tell you something about kind of the sophistication of those who are watching us speak right now. And I'm not just sucking up to them. There are folk who are contemplating what is happening in our streets right now, and ways that we can participate in the liberation and celebrating that Black is beautiful out in the world and in all the ways. And there are folk who are wondering how this journey we've been through as a church, the lessons that we've known and have learned through this experience, how does it inform us as we think about police accountability and the Black community?
Yeah, when I was first coming out in seminary, I'll start by a historical story. When I was first coming out in seminary in the mid 90s, I was trying to connect with the African-American experience and African-American liberation, civil rights movement. And a friend of mine who was in seminary with me and is now a pastor in New York, she said, she called me out and said, "You cannot claim this if you are still in the closet, because you can hide, you can still claim what she would call now white privilege. And it's not until you are completely out that you can do that." And boy, that formed not only helping me become more publicly identified, but also then putting my money where my mouth is, right? Living life in a way that said all the isms intersect. And if one of us is not free, then none of us are free. And so I look at, I look at that in the way that we are having conversations. We have had conversations and are continuing to have those conversations, especially these days, which are so important.
Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Sorry.
You got it.
I keep thinking about, so I was coming of age in the 70s when the women's movement was gearing up, and so was very much informed by that, and have always seen the struggle for liberation and for equality as the same kind of thing for all groups. Now, granted, that second wave of feminism had a lot of faults too that we need to remember and change. Every group has to be aware of the things we did wrong in the past and then move forward and change. But as far as I'm concerned, that all of these issues that we have need to come together. We need to find a way to bring them all together so that we're talking with maybe not one voice, but as a choir of race and gender and sexual identity, gender identity, and all of these things, that we're not in these silos of people, that we must be able to come together in this. I think that's what we have to do right now.
Yeah.
So I think, so I have two quick reflections. As a gay man, I completely understand how difficult it can be to trust police because they have not been helpful in my life, and they've been incredibly harmful. And I think it is also really been powerful to kind of see from my experience as a part of the LGBTQIA plus community that a consolidation of power and kind of the weaponizing of power is a dangerous thing. So and then finally, I've had there's been a lot of times in the church when straight people will try to language for me both my experience and tell me how I should try to organize, or and white people are doing that all the time now with organizers of color, for example, like around defund the police. White folks quibble around the language, and I think we need to follow the lead of people of color. We need to accompany and listen deeply and be allies. And that's what I have told straight people that for decades, that you need to listen more deeply than you have ever listened before to the queer experience. You're still not listening to queer people. And that's true for white people, right? White people want to redefine the experience of people of color in a more kind of, so yeah, maybe some of those things.
I have a lot of different hats that I wear in the world. I am the parent of two beautiful Black children whom I have had conversations with about why they can't take Legos that look like guns outside of our house. I'm also a chaplain to the San Francisco Police Department, so technically an employee of the police department. And what that has meant is that I've been able to participate in a more than a year's long process of creating 3 new general orders to address bias. So the first in the country to address bias by proxy, which is when someone makes a phone call that's biased and then expects the police department to act in biased ways. I have also marched in pride parades in a police uniform with at the request of LGBTQ officers in San Francisco who want a pastor to be with them because they feel like they're not seen, that the reason they're marching is out of one motivation, but the way they're seen is different than the reason that they're marching. And so, so I've literally walked, I think it's 1.5 miles, the Pride Parade 3 different years in their shoes. And so I definitely sit in a really interesting middle space. But what I take from being a part of this LGBTQ history is, number one, valuing that there are people who work on the inside, there are people who work on the outside, and people who dwell in that agitating middle space, which is where I'll call us extraordinary folk, right? Because we weren't on the outside, because, you know, if you said we weren't ordained, we were going to yell at you. And we weren't on the inside, because if you said we had power, we were going to yell at you, right? So we were in the agitated space of the middle. That trying to walk in those worlds in order to try to do the best you can to make the world better the best you can doesn't mean you get to pretend criticisms aren't about you, right? All those criticisms about police departments are in fact about me. All of the listening needs to happen, and you can do your best to like move the boulder as far as you can in the moments that you have those opportunities. I became a police chaplain because LGBTQ members of the police department wanted to know that if they died, there would be a place they could have a funeral. And I can't say that near Craig and not get teary. But there were pastors who were going to not be kind. Perhaps they didn't know to their families if they died in the line of duty. And I couldn't say no to being pastors for people who felt that way. It's hard. It's hard. But what we can do, if we've lived through this in our own skin, is try to not pass on pain to others. So I can hear all of the critique as someone who works in, with, and through the police department without needing to be defensive in ways that triggered me when the ELCA was that way. And to try to just keep doing my best to not use the oppressor's tools to move the ball down the football field. It's not perfect. There are very few days. I've never honestly met a pastor that I thought deserved the title of pastor who didn't think they didn't know what they were doing about at least 25% of the time, if not 100% of the time. And so I think it really is a calling to be people of faith, right? I understand why people don't have faith in police departments, but I am a person of faith who is called to minister in the same way. When I was ministering to the chronically homeless, there were groups of people who didn't get it. I'm going to be someone who's walking in faith to try to make things better. And it means I got a whole new realm of things that I've got to like untangle myself from and go back and read Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Sanctorum Communio 1,000 more times, right? So I think, yeah, I'm going to shut up in modeling of that we should shut up sometimes. How about that? Dawn, do you have any thoughts you want to throw in here?
I don't know if I could add to the wisdom that's already been said. I live in a city where we've had a recent police shooting, so it's very much in the forefront of conversations between myself and community leaders, and we're also discussing the city budget and how much should the police be paid and all that kind of stuff. So it gets really complex, but I think being faithful right now is what I can do most.
Yeah, those are wide words, and in the spirit of that, I'm going to make our final question about how we have faith in the church. Maybe we don't have faith in the institution. Maybe there's just one person. maybe we're low on it. But the way I'll phrase our question of this is, what have you seen that's worked? What have you seen that's been helpful? Where have you seen resurrection? And you can pick anywhere along the timeline we've been on, but where have you seen things go well? Yeah.
So, I don't think the decision in 2009 would have been possible without the civil disobedience that happened at the churchwide assembly in 2005 in Indianapolis, where Bishop Egerton led the arrest of over 60 people, including pastors. And so I see throughout the church constantly that there are voices that are willing to risk and to take a stand and to step up and to speak out and to move onto the street. And that restores my hope. And and that's not just past, that's past, present, and future. I see that happening all over the place now in ways as people find their voice, claim their voice, and act in courageous ways. So I have tremendous hope for this church that we're connected with.
So I had the gift of being at the latest churchwide assembly. And I have to say that that assembly gave me a lot of hope. I mean, there was a protest to stand with people against ICE, and there was an apology to people of African descent. There was some really good work done, and a celebration of the anniversary of the ordination of women. And I don't know if people saw that procession, but they kept having to make space because they didn't allow enough space for their number of women in that procession. And so it was just really, it was beautiful. And for me, it's those little beautiful moments that give me hope, and because they're like little sparks that can grow into something a whole lot bigger.
What about you, Noah? Where do you have hope right now?
Well, I think right now, in part because I'm beautifully inundated by it. It's just the amount of outpouring from the general public of support. I don't know if I've said this here yet, but it seems like every time I stop to answer one of those, I'll have 10 more show up before I get done answering that one quick email or response. And I have hope in a lot of the things that have been mentioned, and that it feels like all of these things are coming together in a way, along with my synod having a historic election for a bishop with Bishop Davenport, and the things going on in this city, that it feels like God is up to something, and that feels almost palpable. And I think that's where I have a strong sense of hope that there is a movement of something, and it really gives me strength, I think, to keep trying to stay involved. Otherwise, it'd be easy to wrap myself up in Fishtown and just disappear. I mean, it honestly would. But I think I keep, over the past year especially, wonderfully being pulled out of that into something else.
Yeah.
The places where I hold on to hope has been the places in my life that I've seen that spark of faith shared with me, and where I've been able to share that with others, where in the hope of God, in truth telling, the importance of truth telling, how rare it is, how the tempter and the lies is out there, and that those who have been truth telling both inside the denomination as well as outside, the radical nuns and priests that I've talked with and learned from, who've encouraged me to use my voice in ways that many Lutheran pastors and bishops haven't, although there are some out there, I'll be honest. Working at summer camps, being a camp counselor myself, and seeing God's grace be shared with folks, and including myself. That's where I first got my first call at Luther Ridge in North Carolina. So a connection out there where Noah is on the East Coast. Seeing that, being able then to be a pastor at Mount Cross, and to minister to people in the Synod Youth Committee. And one of the deepest blessings I get in trying to live in that truth telling, and it's a hard thing to do, but I get to see kids grow right in front of me when they are invigorated by the love of Jesus, by God's grace, and they get it. And I can see them almost just grow and become bigger in their place in the world. It's an honored place to be, and it's a place that I struggle to be, but I also challenge myself to be. So.
Thank you for that. And as we approach the time of the end of our town hall, I want to encourage people to continue living in that growth wherever they find it. And how about I end this with a brief word of prayer? Would that be okay with everybody? All right. Fabulous God, be with all who have ever been lied to and told that they were anything less than your favorite. You knit us together in our parents' womb, and you continue to be our cheerleader and to root for us. Help us to live proudly, to embody your wholeness, and to share stories wherever they need to be told. Amen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Next week, we have a fantastic panel with Rosella and others who will be joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.